in Asia Pacific region. For us, Asia Pacific region is 11 countries, including China, Northern Asia, Japan and Korea, Southeast Asia, and also Australia and New Zealand. I live in Shanghai for last just over 2 years. As you can see in my introduction, I'm not an economist. So what I'm going to share with you, or I wanted to share with you today, is based on my own area of responsibility, what I have experienced, what I have learned. I wanted to share with you some practical tips, but at the same time, I also wanted to bring in some of the know-how, knowledge, inputs, and insights that I have received and collected in last 2 or 3 months, working with consultants, working with other agencies. In these 11 countries around the region that I manage, different countries are at different stage of impact when it comes to corona virus impact. There are countries like China, which are beyond stage 3. There are countries like Korea, which are getting there. And there are countries like Malaysia, Singapore, or Japan, which are just getting into a more severe mode. Yeah, so I hope to bring value to your work from home time, your lockdown time over next 45, 50 minutes. I'm going to focus on 3 areas. I'm going to talk about how the COVID-19 will impact the global and Indian economy, what we can expect the next months to look like. I mean, it's difficult to make a clear forecast, but at least I'll try and share a framework that we are using. And then I'll also share some of the best practices on how we are managing some of the impacts and how some other companies are doing that as well. What you see on the screen is not a surprise for you. The virus has spread globally, and you can see on the map, and we see it probably every day in the news, whole day. We have more than 2 million cases around the world, close to 150,000 deaths already around the world. And this is probably the biggest global challenge that we have seen in almost a century. Since the Great Depression, the world has never seen an economic impact like this. What makes this different versus the previous financial crisis, which was in 2008, 2009, is, first of all, the uncertainty involved. There is no benchmark for such a crisis. There has never been anything like this in the memory of our generations or even the previous generations. So this is really unpredictable uncertainty, which makes it very unique. The second is, as you can see on the screen, the impact is global. It's not only in one country. In 2008, 2009, the majority of the impact happened in one country, in the US, and then it spread globally. But as you can see now, initially it started in China, the infections themselves, but they have continuously over last month spread across the world, and the disruption continues to expand. What also makes it very complex is the governments, the institutions, and people have to balance between safeguarding lives and safeguarding livelihood. As you can see on the screen now, both managing that balance is very, very tricky. As the number of cases rise, and let me see if I can use the pointer here. As the number of cases rise, the imperative for the government is, and the institution is, to suppress the virus as fast as possible. Right? They need to then expand the treatment and testing capacity as the containment measures start to take effect. And then hopefully in near future, we can find better treatment, drugs, and vaccines. But while that is happening, obviously, because of the measures which governments need to take, the livelihoods get impacted. The economic shock is severe. The economic shock is very intense, and pretty much is inverse to all the measures which are required to take to protect the lives. And why is it so? As we have seen in India, we have seen it around the world, and we have experienced in the entire region here, as I mentioned, in different countries. The whole spread actually happens in different phases. It starts in some localized clusters, as you can see on the top. It accelerates, in many cases uncontrolled. With the containment measures, then the de-acceleration starts, and hopefully there is a control which comes in. What are some of the measures that the countries need to take in that case? As the acceleration starts, the physical distancing, the quarantine, the travel restrictions start. I think that is the phase when the supply disruptions take place. As we know now, many plants are closed, logistics is not working. When in my own company, we saw earlier, as soon as the impact was there for first couple of weeks in China, we are not able to run the plant in the same way. As the effect starts to subside, though, as we see it here, the impact starts to occur on the demand side. So while the supplies start to resume, the production starts, there are obviously some initial hiccups, the logistics starts, but then the demand side is impacted significantly. So the measures here, there is only one way to handle this, is through containment and control. But all these measures which are taken then impact supply and demand and challenge the economy. So no wonder then, and again, it's not a surprise for any of you on the call, that the global GDP is impacted. So this is a map from IMF. Just as of yesterday, the global GDP for this year is forecasted as negative 3%, so minus 3% versus the previous year. As you can see on the screen, most of the world is in red. What we see in green, India or China or parts of Asia, are also green on a relative scale. These countries will grow around 2%, significantly lower than what these countries are used to growing in past. And I'll talk about India in a little bit more detail. If you take a close look at APAC region, you can see that even within Asia, while there are several bright spots, we have, as we saw on the previous chart as well, there are a lot of greens around, but the growth has significantly de-accelerated just in a couple of months as they've been forecasted. Plus, the whole timeline of the recovery is uncertain. So it's a little bit busy chart, but you can see that different countries and different parts of the world are expected to return to normalcy in different timelines. Also, these timelines are not written in stone. As you can see, the expectation is that US, Europe, and India would come out of the freeze by May, and then the recovery would start in the third quarter of for the most countries, the third quarter, for India, the second quarter of our financial year. There is an expectation that there could be an V-shaped economic recovery in China and Europe, but in US and many other parts of the world, it could be even U-shaped or even L-shaped recovery. So the recovery would happen at much lower level. Let's move closer home and talk about India. So this is a chart which I found very interesting, comes from McKinsey, and it estimated 3 scenarios for the impact on Indian GDP. Obviously, there is no one way to forecast accurately the GDP impact, but in the 3 scenarios, it looked at 3 key parameters of the whole containment measures. It looked at how intense the impact is, how deeply it will hit us. 2, it looked at how long does it take for situation to normalize, so what's the time period. And the third is what is the shape of the recovery. Okay, so the depth or intensity, the time, and the shape of the recovery. And based on these 3, they came up with a model to estimate the impact on the GDP. And the estimation is, in the best case, the GDP growth for this year, this financial year for us, would be 1 to 2%, and on the mid scenario could be negative 2 to 3. And with all the estimations now, it looks like it would be somewhere between these two, between 2 to minus 2%. Of course, it's not easy to estimate accurately. But let's talk about what's driving this. There are different drivers of GDP growth. And in this case, we can see in this year, all of them are negative. The investment sentiment is going to be negative. Consumer spending is already impacted, will continue to be negative, and we'll talk about that why. Exports are expected to be negative, primarily because the global economy is suffering. The only area which could be slightly positive is the government investments in infrastructure as well as liquidity measures. So what's the best way to estimate which way the economy will go? And again, there is a model that we are using here, and you can see on the screen, to estimate which way the economic activity will move, and try and estimate the likelihood of the GDP growth in this year. So the key factors we are looking at here is how long the outbreak and containment measures last. Okay? So how long is, and I talked about the three measures before, the intensity, the time, and the shape. How much government stimulus is available. So how the government reacts to the stimulus, and then how effective it is. How the domestic economy responds to it. How does the world recover? So what's the external trade looks like? And based on these parameters, we come up with a likelihood of the 2020 or financial year growth to be between the -2% and -2.5%. Looks like, based on these two, as I mentioned before, that the GDP growth is likely to be between these scenarios. Again, no surprise that the lockdown has already started to put pressure on the industry. The overall order books have come down. The production has come down. The capacity utilization has significantly changed. And you can see on the screen, this is an RBI survey before 20th March and after 20th March. The swing is between 50 and 60%. So there is a tremendous swing in all industrial activities in the country. There is a significant challenge on the liquidity, and this will become even worse as we go forward on the liquidity side. And I want to take some time to talk about in the next area, when the recovery happens, and it will happen, it will be uneven in terms of the timing and in terms of the recovery itself by segment. So not all segments are similar. And this is an important point for all businesses to consider for themselves as well as their customers. In our business, being an adhesives business, will serve almost all industrial segments. Our adhesives are used by consumers, they're used by packaging industry, they're used in the construction industry, they're used by industrial manufacturers, they're used by automotive companies as well. As you can see on the chart, there are different sectors are expected to recover differently. In almost all cases, except in consumer staples, we see that the significant part of this year, there will be substantial disruption. And then there will be towards the end of the financial year, there would be return to normalcy. So significant disruption expected throughout the year. So how can you look at your own very specific segment, customers you serve, or the partners you work with? Essentially, the whole impact is determined by the ability to serve and consume. Okay? So how easy or difficult it is for you or your customers to serve their customers or consume defines how long the impact will be and when the recovery will start. You could do something similar for your own industry as well as for your own the industries of your customers. So as you can see on the screen, there are parameters outlined here. There are some industries where large gatherings are essential. Close human interaction is necessary. Hygiene is critical. The business is very dependent on travel, and the expense is postponable. Yeah, it's a discretionary expense, so something that you can do away with. So if you look at different parameters, there are certain areas which are impacted much more. And I'll take one example at the top and one at the bottom. tourism industry is expected to be impacted very, very heavily over here because it's very highly dependent on people coming together, people traveling, and it is something which is usually postponable. If push comes to shove, you would postpone your travel or tourism, and that's one big reason why this is impacted heavily. On the other hand, pharmaceutical industry is highly automated industry. It requires actually low human interaction or touch. If you go to a pharma company, and many of you might be part of that, you try and create clean rooms, you try and create minimal human interaction, and the discretionary spend is usually pretty low, which means the impact on the pharma industry is also expected to be low. As I said, this is a framework that you could use for your own businesses. And of course, you see that already in the numbers. You see on the screen that almost all segments of our industry, agriculture, both on the service side as well as production side, the industry is impacted. These are the numbers, first quarter estimation of this financial year versus the previous quarter. This represents about 2/3 of our GDP, and about 400 million people are employed by these sectors. Also, when we look at this, not only these industries are going to be impacted, the employees working in these and the workers working in these industries are also going to be impacted. What it means is that the demand also is going to be impacted, especially anything which is discretionary. Even when the economy starts to recover, it will be uneven and it will not be pretty. Let's put it this way. Yeah. So key message: the whole impact is severe. It's global. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it is going to take. It's going to take long time for recovery, and it is not going to be even across the segments. So what can the government do, and what it has been doing to revive the economy? Yeah. So when I say revive, I think there are two parts of this. First, we need to survive, and then the second part is to revitalize. The government has to address both these parts. The government needs to make sure that as a country, as economy, as people of this country can survive the impact of the epidemic itself, and then needs to take the step to support the economy, to help survive the impact of the shock that we are all undergoing, and then support the whole revitalization effort. If we see, there are 5 areas that I've highlighted here. And this is again from my thought process and based on all the learnings that I've had over here. First and foremost is to safeguard lives and contain the epidemic. I think the government of India has done a commendable job here. I'd speak to many of my colleagues in Asia, but also around the world. The country head of Italy is a dear friend of mine, and I'm talking to him. Most colleagues that I talk to or customers speak with are highly appreciative of the early measures the government has taken, how institutions from civil services to police to the health workers have actually engaged in containing this epidemic is highly, highly appreciated and is seen with wonder. This kind of containment was expected to be very tough, very difficult in a democracy like India, a vibrant democracy like India. But I think that has been a stellar success. Of course, there are sporadic cases of outbursts. There have been sporadic cases where people have not followed the guidelines. We see that in MP and Indore. You guys are seeing it very closely. I think the second area would be to address the needs of the poor. I think the government has again started on this already. We are all aware of how the government is using the Jan Dhan account and Aadhaar card or the JAM network that we have to make sure that there is a direct cash benefit available to the poor. We are using the public distribution system to make sure that the food grains are available, pulses are available to the poor. This has just started, but I think there is a lot more needs to be done over here. Supporting the SMEs and large businesses, I think again it's just a start. The only measures that we have seen so far are to support the liquidity. There has been a postponement of from the banks. There is a moratorium has been announced. There is a tax filing has been extended. And yesterday I read that RBI has announced even more liquidity to be infused into the business. I think we need to see more measures, and I'm very, very hopeful that we'll see more measures in future. Obviously, as an emerging country, we don't have the same leeway or same economic space that many other countries have. We see in advanced economies like Japan or United States, they have announced between 10 and 20% of their GDP as stimulus already. Yeah, I think those are large sums. But the fact is that they will, even with those stimulus measures, they are expected to fall significantly behind in the GDP growth in coming years. Other countries like India or China, for example, have so far been restrained in announcing the stimulus measures. So far, the measures amount in India to about 1% of the GDP, China around 1.2, 1.3% of the GDP. But I believe that there is more needed over here. A couple of things that I'm seeing here, for example, in China, but also in Korea, that the government here has allowed the businesses to have more cash available with them. They've given them some freedom. A couple of examples we see here is the social security contribution from the business side has been postponed. So there is a period of 3 to 6 months where, depending on the size of the business, where the businesses can not contribute their part of the contribution towards the social security. In some cases, there has been a subsidy on electricity charges, on the real estate cost or rental cost from the government, where the government is giving subsidies through these routes to the businesses. There is also an opportunity and a need to stimulate domestic consumption. I think the good news for India is we are not so engaged globally, apart from our service sector side in software industry, with the world, and we are less dependent on exports. But we also have a huge potential to stimulate domestic consumption by making sure that our population continues to move up from lower middle class to middle class and continues to get towards a more affluent nation. And I think in the end, that is going to be the key. We also have a huge opportunity to upgrade our infrastructure, something which many other countries like China probably won't see much benefit of investment into infrastructure, because they have already done that when in 2008 crisis. Investment into infrastructure or government spend into infrastructure does a couple of things. It drives consumption, because you have consumption of steel, cement. It provides labor opportunities, but it also makes the nation ready to receive more investments and more industrial activity, which I believe would be extremely important in the new normal. We will see more and more countries wanting to have alternative supply chain sources. Many companies who only were buying from one part of the world would want to have second source. And I think India has a great opportunity as the country to revive the whole Make in India drive. One big area which we can start immediately is in pharma. Right? We are one of the largest manufacturers of APIs in the world, and this would be a perfect time for India to invest, accelerate, and be at the forefront of pharma industry in the world. But as I mentioned, India can be right there to benefit in coming years. Obviously, the immediate priority is at the top, and as we move further, there would be other things that we need to focus on. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to take next few minutes to talk about what businesses can do to survive and revitalize. Yeah. But I think as an individual business, as I mentioned, it's important to first look at where we are and where we want to go, so that you can choose an appropriate path to go there. And that obviously depends on which industry, which segment you are, and what the impact on that segment is for yourself. So you see another framework on the screen. It's a framework which, as I mentioned before, which draws on the previous framework. What you saw talks about how big is the impact on your organization, on your company, and your industry. So as you can see on the top, it goes from positive to catastrophic. So some industries which could be more positive, as I mentioned, could be pharmaceutical or e-commerce. Mildly negative, right? For example, consumer goods could be more severe. Example, oil and gas or manufacturing industry or industrial manufacturing could be catastrophic, like tourism or hospitality. The y-axis here is basically the severity and the duration of the economic impact. Is it a quick, short-lived impact? Yeah. Is it a midterm or a long-term impact? As you can see here, depending on where you are, you can decide to ride the wave. So, for example, if you are in e-commerce or pharmaceutical industry, you can easily expect that it's a positive impact, but also not a short-lived impact. Yeah, the world is going to change towards e-commerce. E-commerce is going to become a preferred way of accessing and delivering for near future for even for industrial customers. If you are participating in that segment, then you aggressively push for growth, you aggressively push for market share and continue to build your position in that market. On the other side, you could be in an industry which has a catastrophic impact, and if you it could be a small part of your business, it could be a bigger part of your business, and then you need to take appropriate decisions based on this. So again, you'll have this the framework. This is developed by a consulting company called Board of Innovation. I found it very, very interesting for us to segment our own business, but also our customers in going forward. Obviously, when you look at then once you decide where you are and what your response needs to be, you need to we need to consider both defense as well as offense, right? On the defensive side, obviously mitigating the biggest risk for people, biggest risk in our supply chain, biggest risk in demand side is crucial, but also it is extremely important and critical to prepare for the new world. Because in the end, the people who move fast and move decisively will win, will survive, and will revive, will continue to outperform. You see a few examples over here. Sanofi, which is the French pharmaceutical company, when they were impacted with the slowdown early enough in early 2000s, they actually increased their spend in R&D, yeah, to make sure that they have their pipeline very robust, their innovation pipeline continues to become better, and that way they're able to outperform the peers. You see in the middle, Alibaba, which many of you might be familiar with, is $500 billion e-commerce giant. And when in 2003 SARS hit China and Hong Kong, the population here started to move more towards digital and e-commerce activities. They took advantage of that and then moved towards e-commerce platform significantly. You also see just below that a company called Lin Qingshuan. It's a cosmetics company in China. It's a very recent example. They were selling more through the bricks and mortar traditional model, where they had promoters in the stores. When the COVID-19 impacted them, they moved all these promoters online on a WeChat platform, and they actually see significant growth. So the message here is look at both defense and offense. Yeah, and obviously there is a timeline here. How to respond in the short term is obviously focus on defense. Midterm, which is where I think we are now in India, is the midterm mitigation. We still need to be careful on making sure that we continue to contain, we continue to protect ourselves, but also thinking about the offense. We try and understand what the new economy could look like, what opportunities we could have in our business, and what could look like in the long term. Yeah, and Again, it's a very generic framework, but in the end, you know the business, and this is what each manager needs to adapt to, or the business owner needs to adapt for his or her own business. So I'm going to take now next 10-15 minutes to talk about how to address this impact. And I'm taking this example based on what I did in my business, okay, with my team. We defined 3 top priorities for our business. We said our first priority is safety. Okay? Safety for our employees, for our partners, and our customers. Second, we said business continuity is extremely important. We need to make sure that we stabilize our operations. We also manage our cash flows and continue to actively engage with our customers. And the third is to look for what are the new growth opportunities and how do we become ready for the new normal. Okay. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about all 3 areas in a little bit of more detail. Safety. I think this is and should be number 1 priority, and I'm so glad, as I mentioned before, that the whole country has taken this as our number 1 priority to safeguard the large parts of population. It creates definite economic pain, and even for some people, extreme pain, especially for people who are working on daily wages. But this is extremely important to safeguard the large parts of the country. How do we do that? Number 1, follow the most conservative guidance. Right? So I think if you are a business owner in your own company or you're a manager, look at what is the guidance from the government. There could be a guidance already available from your company. There could be other peers who might be following that. I think the wisdom would be to follow the most conservative area. I think it's important to communicate that guidance with the employees on a very regular basis and with the right area of specificity. So be very specific what behavioral changes that are needed to be made and communicate very actively. Set up a crisis management team. So in many companies, this is already done. If it is not done, please do it and formalize a crisis management team. In my company, we already have a crisis management team. We do crisis management drills on a regular basis. Yeah? Every year, there are once or twice we have drills where we say, if there is a crisis, how would we respond to it? Okay? And it always starts with senior leadership. We need to make sure that we have cross-functional teams with very specific areas of focus, who have very specific and rolling goals, right? So the goals continue to change. There is a very simple reporting and very fast decision making. Okay? So if you don't have a crisis management team today, but I'm sure by now you have already a team which is responding to the shutdown, to the lockdown, and already planning for the future, I would highly recommend that going forward, set up a team. There are numerous tools available online, and do drills regularly so that the team knows if there is another situation like this or a different situation which is evolving very fast, then how to respond to this. And the last but not the least, communicating intensively to enable behavioral adaptation is extremely important. Many of the changes that we will make when the plants open are not something which come intuitively to our workforce. So, for example, temperature checks or wearing masks or maintaining social distance. I think those need to be documented and communicated very, very clearly. And it takes time and repetitive efforts. My company, around the region, we communicate at least on a weekly basis updated guidance about safe working procedures. And if needed, we do it more than on a need basis, more than once in a week as well. In our own organization, we make sure that these guidances are available, are cascaded through the managers. So not only it's an email blast which goes out, but the managers do regular calls and make sure that these are repeated because they take time to reinforce. Yeah, but this is extremely important part to make sure that there is no lapse, there is no slip between the cup and the lip, as they say. I picked some very good quotes from a feedback survey which was done by Alfred Little, and I just picked a couple of examples which I thought might be interesting. So the one which I picked, if you see on the left side, that the CEO there said that I did not think things would go this far, but luckily we stayed focused on the worst case scenario and we were prepared when it was realized. So when it whole epidemic started, the CEO here was not very sure that this is going to go to this extent, but they always put the worst case scenario forward and prepared for that. The second area I want to talk about is business continuity. Yeah. So I think it's important as things start to get to normal, or even during the lockdown, we start to be ready to stabilize our business operations supply chain. So what does it mean? I mean, and hopefully from the 20th of this month, selectively but gradually, the plants would start to open. Right? I think the site readiness is extremely important. Right? The offices will start to open. So again, I'll give you in my own office in Shanghai here. It's must to have as soon as I go to office, there is a temperature screening, thermal screening at the entrance. Every person who is coming in needs to declare where he was in previous 14 days, and if he has been from outstation, there is a clear guidance for home quarantine. We all need to have a mask. No person is allowed without a mask in the office or in the plant. As we were already in the lockdown, we made sure that IT infrastructure is available. There was a regular communication, even trainings by our IT team for people to use the work from home infrastructure. It's extremely important to physically separate operational teams and maintain physical distancing. So when we started our plants in different parts of the region and the world, we started first in different shifts. So we started to reduce the number of people. We spread our production. It impacted the output definitely, but at least we were able to run the plants and reduce the danger. Because the challenge is, even if one person is infected, then the whole plant has the risk of going into lockdown, because then everyone else has to be self-quarantined. We also use this opportunity to train people. Yeah, we train people, our sales teams, on selling skills. Yeah? We train them on technical skills. We trained our operations team on SHE, the safety, health, and environmental behavior. So this is a great time when everyone is at home, has access to digital means, or as they start to come into the plants, but also have some lean period to also upgrade and upskill the entire team. Managing cash flow is extremely important. It's highly recommended. I've seen with many companies and talking to many friends that they did scenarios, because it's very difficult to make a very clear forecast of how the business is going to look like. They made scenarios on the size, time, and shape of recovery, and they made different scenarios based on that, how it's going to impact the cash flow, the P&L, as well as the balance sheet. And then they created what action they need to take based on the different scenarios. So they were ready in advance with that scenario planning on what actions to take. I think this is an extremely important point for us to make sure that our business continues to sustain as the things start to either get worse or hopefully become normal. Of course, cash is king, and very high focus on cash management, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Actively engaging with customers is very important to understand which way the business is going and how the future looks like. And I'll talk about that part a little bit more in detail. So when we started, when we went into this epidemic, we trained entire sales team on how to work from home. Okay? We also created some very specific guidance for them and KPIs for them to interact with the customers. So we trained them, but we also set some expectations, and we trained them on how to use the virtual tools like Skype or Microsoft Teams, or or WebEx meetings to work with the customers. I think there's a tremendous benefit in doing that. There's a great opportunity to create emotional bond and feeling of trust with our customers. I think all of us, when we're working from home, it's great to hear a voice that you can trust and you would like to uh, uh, be a part of your future plans. It's extremely important to create that sense of security and stability with the customers. So that only can happen when you interact with the customer and try and understand what their operational goals are, how they see their business changing in next weeks and months. Plus, also identify new opportunities. We are doing a number of digital trainings for our customers and their engineering teams. We are working with them on projects which they want to already start working on for future. Of course, this has several severe limitations when you do it remotely, but this is the future. We all better get used to it. Working capital management is, again, I don't want to overemphasize this. Managing how fast that churn we can do is extremely important. It's extremely important to build and consider extra costs towards safety and sanitization as soon as the plants start to open. Please consider the risk for disruption in supply chain. As soon as we went into the epidemic, and since then we have had our purchasing team continuously in contact with our suppliers to understand their viability, the challenges they might be facing, or how we can help our suppliers and their vendors to to sustain through, because in the end it could be one small part of our business, but it might impact our viability. And then we need to look at different options of partial shifts running as well as contractual labors, and all this impacts working capital. For the time sake, I'll skip this, but essentially on this slide, I'm talking about what sources of funds we could look at. Obviously, there is a help from the government in this area, but as businesses, we need to also look at what capex we want to put on hold or defer, because in many cases, given the uncertainty, we don't want to commit too far ahead and too much, and so that we don't lose the agility and flexibility which might be needed to manage the cash in this period. The last part is to look at being ready for the new. And there are two areas I believe are extremely important here. First and foremost is to provide to our teams practical and visionary leadership. It's a balance between being hands-on as well as looking at the future. Extremely important is to over-communicate. And I want to emphasize that, over-communicate with employees, because this is a time to bond with them, to make sure that you can reassure them, you can empathize with your teams, you can empower your teams, and at the same time listen to what they are doing. As a leader, we need to all be focused on the immediate, on the short term, because that's crucial to manage, but also be aware of the future. As leaders and managers, we need to stay physically and mentally fit so that we can continue to support our organization. We need to make sure that we are fast, we assume the worst case, but be comprehensive. So we are not thinking only in steps, but we are thinking further along. And while we are being fast and agile, we also have an underlying framework, and some of those we spoke about when we make decisions, so that we don't make ad hoc decisions. We are not forced into making decisions which we might regret in future. Yeah. So I have a quote here which I like a lot. For us to be leaders and managers, we need to make sure that our actions inspire others to dream more, to learn more, to do more, and become more. Last but not the least, I think this is also the time to identify new growth opportunities. The future of the world is going to be low touch. Yeah? And we need to all individually see what it means for us, right? In manufacturing side, on supply chain side, but also on our customer side. It is highly recommended, and everyone that I spoke to set up a separate team, separate from the team which is managing the crisis already. Yeah? This team should look at new emerging customer needs on how we serve the customers, what else they need from us, including the changes in their adaptation or adoption of online services. Our world will be smart and digital going forward. We need to make sure that we are ready how our teams can continue to work virtually. We need to look at how we can invest and where we need to invest in efficiency, automation, and predictive tools. We also need to learn from the crisis. So leveraging the experience that we have in rapid decision making and delegation during this crisis, it should not get lost, and this team should make sure that we capture that. Also, start preparing on better crisis preparedness, as well as more effective business continuity and risk management is very important. So I spoke about this before. If you don't have a crisis management team, this is a good time to start thinking about it. Also, depending on how big is your risk appetite, you can look at new M&A opportunities, mergers and acquisition opportunities, which might come out of the shakeout, because that's definitely a likelihood in the future. Okay. So, what is the key takeaway before I conclude and take some questions? The key takeaway for me is I would, from last couple of months, I see that the impact on the economy is going to be intense. It is going to be global. It is going to accelerate, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the way this whole thing unfolds. Okay? So the change is inevitable. Okay? The change is intense, and the change we cannot just wish away, right? And the big takeaway for us is we need to make sure that we are agile and responding to the change. In the end, the companies and the businesses and the leaders who will come out of this the strongest will be the ones which are able to change themselves and which are able to adopt and respond to the change in the best way possible. Okay. With that, I would stop my presentation, and I would actually look at some of the questions which I might have. So give me a couple of minutes to see how we can look at any questions which are here.
Request participants to please write your questions on the chat so that Mr. Pradhyumna can answer.
Okay, so let me. I should say. I'm just scrolling through. Okay, I think initial few questions were all about when is it going to start. But then I see Anil Jain sir reaching out, and Jain sir, thank you for reaching out, and happy to connect with a fellow KGaA, and I'll definitely connect with you separately as well. I think going okay. Right. Okay. So there is one question which I would respond. I think I got this question even before. Is how China managed to protect so safe other places except Wuhan? This is a question I also got a couple of weeks ago from. I prepared a video based on the request of some of the organizations back in India, and then I was talking to somebody who also called me from Devas actually to talk about this topic. So the fact is, it is not 100% true that provinces outside of China were not outside of Wuhan were not impacted. Just in Shanghai, for example, we had over 500 cases. Beijing, similar number of cases. Guangdong province down south, which is further away from Wuhan, which is central China, had a few thousand cases. So the impact was almost everywhere in China. I think what worked well for China is the containment. And I think that's exactly what we did really well in India, is to contain, put containment measures early in the epidemic cycle. So 25th of March, 25th of January is the day of Chinese New Year, the first day of Chinese New Year. About 500 to 600 million people travel across the country and across the world during those holidays. It's a week-long holidays. When you add weekends, and it becomes a little bit longer. On 23rd of March, the Chinese government locked down Wuhan. Okay? And then in the next day, they locked down the whole province. And then within the next day, they locked down the entire country. And it was a very, very strict lockdown. Very strict lockdown. The only essential services were open. Even in places like Shanghai, which were less impacted compared to Wuhan, the restrictions were severe. You could only go out to buy essential goods. Even now, sorry, so let me back up a little bit. So it went on for almost 6 weeks. So the whole lockdown was for almost 6 weeks. It only lifted gradually. The essential services were opened first. Essential manufacturing plants were opened then. Then the rest of the manufacturing activity started. In offices, were the last to start. I can give you example of my office. Early, we only started people to go to office after 5 weeks of lockdown. Yeah, so in the 6th week, in the first week after opening, it was only 1/3 of the employees were allowed to come in. Okay. The next week was 50%, and the week after was 2/3, and then the 4th week. So we took 4 weeks to get all employees to come to our office. We also, even now, as I mentioned before, even today, after now, when the lockdown is finished, even then, in every office, in every supermarket, even in Starbucks, even in our residential campus right here, we can't get in without having our temperature checked and wearing a mask. Why this? Because as you all of you know, and there is a lot of reports out there, the virus in 95% of the cases, people recover by themselves. 5% of the cases, which is a significant number, you still need to be hospitalized. Yeah, you still need people to go to the hospital. And those are the cases by keeping people under lockdown or under isolation or maintaining the social distancing, you see a large number of cases recovering by themselves because there is no medication. But at the same time, they don't, during this period, they don't infect others. Yeah, and that's where that lockdown has been very, very successful. I will also look at any other question. There is one. I think there's a comment saying the cost of production will go up for sure, which I believe which is true. I think the cost of production will go up drastically everywhere, especially because of the social distancing measure. There are some input costs which might go down and have already gone down. So if your industry is dependent on petrochemicals or oil, then you already see that the costs are going down. To that extent, the costs are going down, but manufacturing costs are going to go up. The logistics costs are going to go up. Okay. I have another. I can take one more question. Still a couple of minutes. So, any views about heavy goods and capital-intensive industries? I think again, it's going to be a big challenge, right? I think it would be the biggest advice I would have over there is to maintain the capex, because in all heavy goods industry, typically the capex is the big driver of growth as well as differentiation. Because the demand is going to be not easy to predict, I think this is the time to make sure that you engage in those projects and those industries and make capex decisions accordingly, which are going to get support from the government. Because next 1 to 2 years, the big boost to the economy, especially in the heavy goods industry, is going to come from the government. Okay? Beyond that, the things when this big start to become normal, the heavy goods, heavy machinery, or the large industrial goods will start to pick up. So it would be good to use the framework that I shared previously to look at how your customers are going to respond, which parts of your customers will recover first, and focus your capital efforts in serving those customers first. Okay. With that, I think we are just a few seconds away from a close. So I wanted to once again thank you all for being very patient and listening to me. If there are any additional questions or insights, please reach out to me through IMA. They have my email address, and I can Nina or other IMA team can share that with you, and I would be happy to address those on one-to-one, and happy to see you in person when I'm in Indore next time.
Sure, Pradhyum. We thank you, Mr. Pradhyum Ingle, for the wonderful session and sharing a very valuable thoughts. My sincere thanks to all the participants to motivate us by being a part of this session. Please drop a message or mail to us for any queries. We'll be sharing the presentations with you. So you can always give us on mail. We can give you the answers from Pradhyum.
Thanks, guys. Stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.